How many of us knew what the CDC was before the outbreak of the coronavirus? If you're like me, then you probably had no idea what they were or even what the acronym stood for. The CDC is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And as I have learned in the past 3 months, they actually serve a pretty important role. Their role is to notify the public of any potentially dangerous diseases which might be circulating and how we can combat these diseases, as well as how we can limit our exposure to them. For example, with the coronavirus, they recommend wearing a face mask. They also recommend washing your hands throughout the day, limiting the amount of time you are spending in public places, and maintaining 6 feet of distance between you and the nearest person. All of these are general recommendations that have been given so that we could hopefully stay healthy and avoid the disease. Now, I know there's a bit of a disagreement between sides about whether or not the coronavirus is as serious as the media is making out to be. But hopefully, what we can do is we can all agree on the severity of a more common disease. And that is one which you see in the media but never warned about in the media. And that is sin. Sin is a disease, and God has pictured it as a disease plenty in His Word. God will use the images of leprosy. We see that in Leviticus 13 and 14, and pestilence in 1 Chronicles 21 when speaking of sin. God will even speak about those who are in sin as being as like gangrene, 2 Timothy 2 and verse 17. Now, do you think that the tie between sin and disease is purposeful? Wouldn't you think that God uses disease as a picture of sin to illustrate how deadly it can be? Romans chapter 5 and verse 12 says, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned." In addition to this, God says in Romans 6 and verse 23 that the wages of sin is death. It is the due payment. It is the due reward. Now, sin is costly. Sin is costly, and more than that, it is deadly. And so, with that bit of information, the point is then clear that if we want to live, we need to be avoiding sin. Now, with that said, I want to just give you a few pieces of advice that I know can help us to avoid sin and help us to stay pure and holy before God. First, I want to give you some advice on avoiding day-to-day exposure to sin. These are practical things to keep in mind for the daily struggle and battles that we have with the flesh. My first piece of advice would be to think. I know this seems a little simple, but sometimes the best answer to life's questions are just that simple. We need to be thinking. We need to be thinking about the sort of entertainment we are using. We need to be thinking about the sort of music we are listening to. We need to be thinking about the sort of friends that we may have. And also, we need to be thinking about the sort of things that we have been thinking about. So much of who we are and how we act is influenced by the things around us. In addition to that, so much of who we become has to do with what we think about. My second piece of advice would be to ask questions. Questions are good because they cause us to think, and they cause us to take a moment to reflect honestly. Now, these are just a few questions I thought of. Now, perhaps you can think of others, and if you do, I encourage you to put them in the comments section so that we can all benefit from them. One question I thought to ask myself is, what kind of language am I exposing myself to? Do the shows, the movies, or the music that I listen to use bad language? Another question would be, what kind of themes do these media formats have? Should I be involved with music or shows that have suggestive themes? Do they encourage bad habits and sin? A third question to ask is, well, what kind of friends do I have? Are they Christians? And if not, are they at least morally aligned with me? Do they practice sin? Do they encourage me to practice sin? Do they bring out the worst in me or the best in me? As far as our thoughts are concerned, I think a good question would be, what do I think about throughout the day? In addition to that, I would ask myself if those thoughts are ones that I would proudly share. Would I share them with a friend? How about with another Christian? What about with a parent or a stranger? Would I be willing to share them with God? My third piece of advice for avoiding day-to-day exposure would be to consider the Scriptures. Consider with me Colossians 3 in verses 1 through 4. Paul says, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." Am I a Christian? If so, are my thoughts where they need to be? Are they focused on heavenly things or worldly things? Consider also Philippians 4 and verse 8, where Paul says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things." Am I thinking about honorable things? Am I thinking about commendable things? How about praiseworthy things? I know I ought to be. Consider with me also 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33. Paul again, he says, "Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals." Do not be deceived. Don't think that you are above these things. Don't think that you have impenetrable armor. Don't think that you are immune and can't fall. Paul said, "Therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall." 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12. Last, consider with me Proverbs 27 and verse 17, where it says, "Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another." Do my friends sharpen me or dull me? Does the media that I expose myself to sharpen me or dull me? If I am dull, how can I be of any use in the army of God? Now I want to share with you some advice for avoiding long-term exposure to sin. These are some practical things to keep in mind as you are planning your life. First, and again, I want to advise you to think. Think about who it is you will be dating, or even who you will marry. Think about what school you will go to. Think about what kind of job you will work in. Think about where you are going to live. And also be sure to think about where you intend to attend worship. Second, and again, I want to advise you to ask questions. Ask the question, am I dating a Christian? Are they a strong Christian? If they're not a Christian, do they seem like they would become a Christian? Is the person I'm dating going to excuse my sin? Are they going to cause me to stumble? Will they hold me accountable? Ask questions about your school. Is there a strong church there? Do I know other strong Christians there? Be sure to ask questions about the sort of job you will take. Will I be working around immoral people? Will my job tempt me to compromise my Christianity? Is my job going to make the Christian life unnecessarily harder? Ask questions about where you will live and worship. Is there a church there? Is the church there strong and active? These sorts of questions are good because even though we know they're important, they sometimes evade our minds. We want to have a life full of exciting adventure, but sometimes that's not what's best for having a home with God. Third, and again, I want to advise you to consider the Scriptures. Consider the sad scene of Nehemiah 13. Nehemiah is having to rebuke the people and separate their families because the Israelites had married foreign wives and had children with them. It says that those children didn't even know the language of God's people, much less know about God. Think about 1 Kings 11. This chapter talks about Solomon and the 1,000 women that he took to be his wives and concubines. He engaged in many of these relationships for political gain, but also for spiritual loss. He went on to build idols for the gods of these women, and they drove his heart away from God. I think we can certainly learn from these two examples on how it is that we need to be choosing our spouses and how we can begin to make preparations to start families. I also want us to consider Genesis 39. Genesis 39 talks about the interaction between Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Now, what's interesting here is that Joseph left. Perhaps Joseph left to avoid temptation, perhaps to hopefully clear his name of transgression, but perhaps another reason that he knew to leave was that even if he was to stay and be proven innocent, it would have just made his life all the more difficult, and for no good reason would he be placing himself in the midst of temptation. I think we could use that point in application with our schooling and professions. There is no need to be seeking out and willfully accepting more chains to our bonds. I know this is simple and I know this is short, but I hope that these things will serve you as something of profit. I know that a discussion regarding how we can make spiritually wise decisions can first seem complicated, but hopefully this makes it easier. Hopefully we all will continue to think, will continue to ask questions, and will continue to consider the scriptures as we do our best to present ourselves to God as living sacrifices, Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. I appreciate you viewing this, and I encourage you to share any comments, questions, or concerns with us. Thank you, and may God bless you.